How's it going, everyone, and welcome in for another edition of the unofficial WCC Hoops podcast. I know it's been a few days since the championship game. There were a few things happening back home needed to take care of, but back into it. Post Gonzaga WCC Tournament championship, post WCC Tournament, post Las Vegas, all of those things, and only a couple of days away from Selection Sunday, which obviously is one of the more exciting days on the calendar, one of the crazier weeks that we always enter into, as we were only a week away from the start of the NCAA tournament, as well, days away from the start of the NCAA tournament. So it's obviously a hugely fun time of year as the conference tournaments from everybody else outside of the WCC and some of the smallers continue to wrap up in the next couple days, and what we're going to see. So I'm going to recap what we saw between Gonzaga and Saint Mary's. Obviously, the Zags winning the WCC championship 58-51. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about also the seedings that we might see between Saint Mary's and Gonzaga. A lot of different scenarios of what we could still see from these two teams. Pretty well set, I think, for Saint Mary's, but Gonzaga seems like the one that has maybe the greatest variation still. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Also, a little bit on the scenarios of postseason for everybody else in the WCC, of what we could see from the USFs, the Santa Claras, Oregon State, and whatnot. And then also maybe a little, and then we'll talk about the portal, because guess what? The first name has dropped from the WCC, and that did happen right at tip-off of the championship game on Tuesday. So we will talk about the first portal entry from a West Coast Conference school. But we will start off with the WCC championship game, Gonzaga and Saint Mary's. The game that ended, as mentioned before, 58-51. And this was a rock fight. This was a defensive struggle. No one shot it well. This felt like one of those, an old Big East game. Just the physicality, the toughness, the back and forth of these two teams. This really was. It wasn't pretty to watch, but this was wildly entertaining to just see how close these two teams continued to make this game. And we'll start it off at the beginning of this matchup and the wrinkle that we got in the starting lineup, which was Braden Huff being entered in place of Ben Gregg. And that was we talked a lot about what's Gonzaga's counter to the double big of St. Mary's was going to be. How would they be able to kind of utilize their pieces in a different way? We talked about maybe how Diane was going to be used. Diane was not used at all in this game. And that's largely because of the impact that Braden Huff had from the get-go. Both he and EK were off to the races immediately. They scored 12 of the first 16 Gonzaga points. Huff's ability to really get going early forced Paulos Morauskas off the floor very quickly, and Harry Wessels got back into the game. But even he wasn't all too effective early on, as he picked up a couple quick turnovers. And the Zags were the aggressor out the gate. They forced 4 St. Mary's turnovers. They scored 9 points off of that. They had a 20-7 lead very quickly, and St. Mary's was all out of sorts early on. But as the Gales have done, they started to crawl back into this game. They started to find ways to slow Gonzaga down on the defensive end and started to do just enough to get back into the contest as we continued on. Mitchell Saxon had one of his best offensive nights of the season. He had 14 points in the first half, 4 of 6 from the free throw line. He did finish with 20. St. Mary's had a 23-14 rebounding advantage in the half and cut the lead down to 2 at the break. It really seemed like St. Mary's had the momentum, even had a chance to take the lead or tie the game or even take the lead before the break. And now, in both the first matchup and the second matchup, St. Mary's really had kind of jumped out in front of the Zags, and it really was Gonzaga, who had to play catch up in both of the first two games. That was not the case in this one. So going into the second half, what we saw in the first two matches was Gonzaga jump out to and go on a really nice run at the beginning of the second half. And of course, this is going to be a point of emphasis for St. Mary's to try to stop. And I do think they did a pretty good job of that, as it felt like every time Gonzaga was ready to maybe break away completely, St. Mary's found a way to keep them in the game, keep them at arm's length. And we saw that continuously throughout the second half until later on, when it finally felt like Gonzaga was able to lean on St. Mary's a little bit more, force more of those turnovers that we had been seeing. And also because Caleb Battle was a huge factor in this game. He had only had 14 points, but 5 steals. He and the rest of the guard core disrupting passing lanes, double teaming the SMC bigs, and forcing a lot of miscues from the Gales. St. Mary's had 18 turnovers in this one. A team that only averages 9.5 had near double that to Gonzaga's 4. Gonzaga had a 20-3 points off turnover advantage. Even though St. Mary's was able to hang around because of the rebounding, they finished off with a 43-28 rebounding advantage, plus 15 in that category, which very much a St. Mary's game. And if you had told me the game was going to end 58-51, I would have said St. Mary's won that game. But this was a great defensive performance from Gonzaga. They did everything right on the defensive end. They didn't do a whole lot of things right on the offensive end, but they did enough to get the job done, get the championship. Braden Huff had 18 points in the game. Mentioned Caleb Battle, 14 and 5. Dre McKay only had 11 in this game, but his impact was still pretty significant despite that. He ended up being the most outstanding player for the WCC tournament. One of the best things about what Gonzaga did in this game was the defense on Morauskas, Ross, and Mikey Lewis. Morauskas and Ross, the other two starters for St. Mary's, were held scoreless, 0 for 12 from the field. Mikey Lewis was held to 5 points. He really did not shoot it well at all after being the leading scorer in the first two matchups. Everything was going their way. The only thing that didn't go well, and this was for either team, just the horrific three-point shooting, the unexplainable poor three-point shooting. 1 for 31 combined for the two teams. Gonzaga was 1 for 15. St. Mary's 0 for 16 in that game. And if you're anyone who hasn't been watching the WCC or hasn't been paying that close of attention, obviously that's a bad look. But these two teams, like when you have rivalry games like this, sometimes these games happen, and it really is just a matter of almost who wants this more, who has the second effort, the third effort, who's really kind of on top of at least the effort game. And Gonzaga really felt like that was them all night long. The alternate team: Mo Odom, Augustus Marshallonis, Mitchell Saxon, Caleb Battle, and Graham Ike. The 5 who were on the alternate team, which was essentially I had 4 of these picks: Battle, Ike, Marshallonis, and Odom. The only one I switched out was Ryan Beasley in my picks instead of Mitchell Saxon. But Saxon had a great championship game, so there's not really like an egregious error in my mind on the alternate team. And of course, the Zags got to celebrate in Las Vegas. I, along with a lot of the St. Mary's folks, decided to dip out maybe a little early out of the Orleans and go drown our sorrows on our own. But we are now into thinking about the NCAA tournament and what now the seedings are going to be. The regular season is over. The tournament is over. It is now about the postseason. What are we going to see from these two teams? Where are they going to be seated? Who are they going to see as we go into the tournament next week? And for Gonzaga and Saint Mary's, there were at least some shifts. For Saint Mary's, a lot of people had them at a 5 line before that game, and they are now essentially almost unanimously at a 6 at this stage. They'll be likely a 6 seed. Where they go, who knows? But that obviously presents some interesting matchups on that 3 line if St. Mary's were to advance. There are also definitely some matchups on the 11 line that aren't terribly great for St. Mary's. I mean, like even just thinking about some of the other matchups, I think I saw one where they were the 11 seed across for them was Drake, and Drake is definitely one team would be very nervous to actually end up facing if I was St. Mary's. But we will see kind of like what that's going to look like. The 3 seeds, I think that could be an Iowa State, maybe not anymore after losing again to BYU the other day. That could end up being someone like maybe not an Oregon anymore, but I have to take a look at some of those matchups and just kind of see like who are we seeing? What are those matchups going to look like? Let me pull one up right now just so that I have it in front of me. I mean, some of the 3 seeds, I mean, the Kentucky one feels very, very iffy for me. Texas Tech would be an interesting matchup. Texas A&M would be an interesting matchup. Again, these are all assuming that St. Mary's were to advance past a 6 seed. Even the other 11s, a VCU, which honestly, VCU is probably sick and tired of seeing St. Mary's because they have seen them twice over the last decade or so in the tournament and have lost both times. West Virginia sitting on that 11 line, and then also Indiana and San Diego State could potentially be a play-in game, and they're on the 11 line. A lot of interesting matchups. St. Mary's, we know going into the tournament, one of the challenges, one of the things most everyone points out about their ability to succeed is the lack of athleticism or the fact that they don't always have offensive weapons that can explode in a tournament. Now, I do think that at least in that latter case, there is at least one answer to that, and that's been Mikey Lewis. But matchups. I think St. Mary's really had a very poor matchup last year with Grand Canyon, and their second round matchups the last few years prior also were not great ones. Obviously, UConn seeing them during their first title run, and then also a UCLA team that also ended up going deeper into that tournament as well. So you kind of you look at those and maybe you can read into what you want, but there's very clear like what some of St. Mary's challenges have been, and we will see how this team is able to fare. A team that at the very least you could say is healthy going into the NCAA tournament, which a year ago they were down 2 of their top 8 rotation players, so a little bit more of a challenge a year ago than it would be this year. Now for Gonzaga, it's wild to me that they are still kind of up and down in a lot of the rankings, a lot of these seedings. Now, on the high end right now, they are looking at a 6, and Gonzaga, I think seems about right for them. But I've also seen them down still on that 8 line, and I don't see how they could be on the 8 line still after beating St. Mary's. You look at the fact that they still have the win over Baylor. They do have good wins. They obviously don't have a bad loss on their resume, but there is a concern about the lack of good road wins. There is the concern about the lack of maybe a quote marquee win, which they may not have. Their best win is the win against St. Mary's just the other night. And is that enough to bump them further up? Probably not, definitely not up all the way to a 5, which is where they were a year ago, but definitely it feels like they should be at least a 7 going in, if not a 6 on the same line as St. Mary's. So it feels like that's about where they're going to end up. Again, it's kind of like similar matchups. We're talking about what they could end up seeing or whoever else. If they end up at an 8, that seems wildly disrespectful if they end up down there. And I'm sure there's a 1 seed is not going to want to see them, especially if, say, you're at 8-9 and your 1 is Duke now after the potential injury to Cooper Flagg and what he's going to look like. Yes, he returned to the bench after leaving the game with an ankle injury, but his condition moving forward will be interesting to continue to monitor. And the other ones as of right now, I mean, Auburn, Houston, Florida, even the potential for if like an Alabama or Tennessee were to still have a chance to move back up. There's a lot of firepower on those teams, and Gonzaga's defense would be tested in these. Now, we've seen them play a lot better defense over the last month and a half, but thinking it through of what they could see in a second-round matchup would be interesting. Again, a team that has been to 9 straight Sweet 16s, a team that is an automatic to get at least by round 1 at this stage, and even a loss in round 1 seems like an improbability, just something that you can't even fathom with Gonzaga because they've been so consistent in the first weekend of the tournament over near the last decade. So that's probably about where we're going to see those two squads end up, right around the 6-7 line. We'll see regionally where those two end up. Obviously, ideally, they could still end up as in the West Regional, which is in San Francisco this year, and then the 2 at least regional locations for the first 2 rounds, Seattle and Denver. Denver seems at least still a possibility for both squads. Seattle seems like the one that is probably out of reach, but we'll see what happens with the seedings and who ends up where and all that. And that's for the NCAA tournament. They're not the only ones who are going to find out their postseason fates in the next few days. The others are USF, Santa Clara, and Oregon State. These 3, I've seen at least one potential bracket that has said that they could all be NIT teams, which I think is very possible that all 3 could end up in that pool. Oregon State, I feel like, is maybe a little bit more questionable on that front, especially based on the fact that they lost to Pepperdine in the WCC tournament. That loss is the one that really feels crippling more than anything else. But that tournament has been expanded a little bit, and that tournament does try to also put programs that at least have some level of a name in it as well. So Oregon State could end up still holding on to one of those lower seeds in that tournament. Santa Clara, I think they're going to be somewhere in the middle of the pack for the NIT. They still had an overall solid season, even though it ended disappointingly for them. This was a team that had aspirations of being in the NCAA tournament, was unable to realize those, lost in the WCC tournament to Pepperdine, and had too many bad losses on their resume. And that is why Santa Clara is going to be kind of placed where they are. Somewhere in the mid-tier, maybe they get one home game at the Levy Center, but NIT bound does feel right for that Santa Clara squad, that veteran-laden Santa Clara squad. And of course, USF. I mean, USF, all year long, they were the team with the highest floor of the rest of these teams. I always felt like we knew that they were going to be 20-plus wins. You knew that they were going to be consistent. You knew they were going to handle their business against the teams they needed to handle business against. And that was true. They beat the teams they were supposed to beat. And they got at least a couple more wins against some of the better teams that they went up against, but not enough of them. And that is what happened this year. They were able to beat Saint Mary's. They were able to beat Boise State. They were able to take one from Santa Clara, take one from Oregon State, or sweep Oregon State. They did some good things, but it wasn't enough. There wasn't that another big marquee win outside of the St. Mary's game that was able to push USF over the hump in this one. I think now this is a team that could end up being a 2 seed in the NIT. I think that would be a good spot for them. And at the very least, you're going to have a lot of really good competition in the NIT. A lot of teams that are going to still be hunting for postseason wins. And for a lot of these teams, postseason, regardless of where it is, does mean something. It is valuable, and it's something they're going to be energized for. And I know that USF is disappointed that they won't make the NCAA tournament. Santa Clara is going to be disappointed. Oregon State, maybe because of where they were a year ago, just even getting back to this level is a big step for them. So for all three of these teams, I mean, are they all capable of doing some damage in the NIT? Yeah, they're absolutely capable. So we'll see what their matchups are all going to be. I would expect USF should definitely be hosting a game. Santa Clara, maybe they're hosting. Oregon State, if they have to hit the road, well, we know how well they play or, well, don't play away from Gill Coliseum. So we'll take a look at that matchup and see if Oregon State can also maybe turn that narrative around in the postseason. Now, there is one other college basketball tournament that is going to be happening in the postseason, and I just want to talk about the College Basketball Crown, which will be held in Las Vegas and starts on March 31st. This is the one that brand new tournament that's being hosted by Fox that will highlight the Big 10, Big 12, and Big East teams that didn't make the NCAA tournament. And the first thing that crosses my mind when it comes to this, who's going to watch that tournament? For a number of reasons. One of the reasons why we love watching even the NIT is you get to see some of the best mid-major programs up against some of these mid-tier power programs, and they get to show that they actually are better than those mid-tier programs. Also, it's also because it's happening on the off days of the NCAA tournament. The NIT has done a really good job of at least making sure that there's basketball on the other days of the week that the NCAA tournament is not running. So you can be able to watch both tournaments at the same time. And then, of course, it wraps before the NCAA tournament is done. Well, that is not going to be the case for the College Basketball Crown. They don't even start until March 31st. And for me, at that stage, you're looking only a few days away from the national championship game and the Final Four of why am I going to watch this tournament when the Final Four is less than a week away? Why? Why am I going to watch these very mid power conference teams play each other when, let's be honest, there's a very good chance a lot of those rosters are not even going to be put together anymore. A lot of those guys are going to hit the portal. The portal also, not only has it already started, as we're going to get into in just a bit, it also has a shorter window than it did a year ago. So if you're looking to shop yourself, you're looking for your next team, trying to figure out your NIL deal or whatnot, you're not sticking around with the likes of a Rutgers. You're not sticking around with these teams that are going to be sitting down at the bottom. Is a Stanford or a Cal going to get invited? Okay, I said ACC teams, but okay, let's say is a DePaul going to get invited to this tournament? Who from the DePaul team is going to be left on the squad to play this thing? I don't know what these rosters are even going to look like, who's available, who even cares about playing in this tournament. You're probably going to get a lot of teams who say, no, pass on this thing. I don't think you're going to get a lot of interest from coaching staffs, from rosters, from fan bases. I do not see the audience for this tournament. And because let's say as become very habitual now, there are teams that may lose their entire roster, especially teams that are toward the bottoms of their leagues. So what? Let's say we got a Big 12 team, and I'm just going to pick on Oklahoma State for this one. And what if they lose 10 of the 13 guys that are on the roster? They're not playing. They're unavailable. Well, what are you going to do roster-wise? Either are you going to be able to pick up a few extra walk-ons, or you know what? Maybe instead of the players playing in these, we have the team manager games and let them duke it out from these Big 10 teams, these Big 12 teams, or whatnot. Honestly, that might be a little bit more entertaining, and they would be actually a little bit more hyped to play in that tournament than even the players would. I do not see the value or the excitement or why you would even be interested in this tournament outside of, hey, there's a few more games to be gambling on, which of course this is being held in Vegas, so that might be the biggest component of why this is going to go forward and everything else. But I don't see the advantage for teams. I don't see the advantage for coaches. I don't see the advantage for the players to even be involved in this specific tournament. And speaking of guys who have hit the portal, the first name was announced from the WCC on right at tip-off of the Gonzaga Saint Mary's game, and that was one of the stars of the WCC tournament, and it was Mo Odom. It was announced by multiple sources. He has had double-doubles in each. He had double-doubles in each of his last 5 games. This will be the second time in 2 years he's entering the portal. Remember, he transferred from Pacific to Pepperdine last year. Named to the All-WCC Tournament team. 13 points per game, 7.5 assists. He's a junior. He does have 1 more year of eligibility, so we will see how he's able to level up. I'd imagine that after the performance he had this year and the continued kind of sustained success he's had with his numbers, that he'll find, I think, a nice home with a power program somewhere. He could end up being either a 6-man for one of those teams, or if he's at a lower tier power team, he could end up starting for one of them. So for Mo Odom, now I do wish that if he can stick around in the WCC, that would be great, because he is a really good point guard. He's fun to watch. He's been one of my favorite guys over the last few years. But as he's kind of searching through what is available, who's going to be a great fit, I could very easily see him taking his talents outside of the WCC finally, and maybe even returning closer to home, which is in the Bronx. So maybe a return to the Northeast for him would be in order. But for Mo Odom, it appears that the end of the road might be here for his time in the WCC. 2 years at Pacific, 1 year at Pepperdine after a great, great run in the WCC tournament. All right, well, the Selection Sunday, only a couple days away. We will continue, obviously, the coverage of what's going to be happening in the tournament. We'll do an episode to talk about the matchups, what we're going to see. We'll dive into that day after day as we get deeper and deeper into the WC or into the NCAA tournament. Talk a little bit about what we're going to see from the other squads as well, the other postseason teams. And of course, portal season has started, so there will be the continual monitoring of what we're going to see throughout the next 45 days and what the portal brings us. Who is going to be taking their talents elsewhere? Who is going to be sticking around? And all of that. All right. Well, that'll do it for this episode of the unofficial WCC Hoops podcast. Be sure to hit the subscribe button and follow along on social media at Post by Zach and at unofficial WCC pod. The postseason is finally here. Selection Sunday, just a couple days away, so we will find out all the details this Sunday. Thanks for watching, everybody, and I will catch you later.